Looking back, I can pinpoint the moment when things started to feel off. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just little things that added up. Melissa, my wife, started staying late at work more often. She'd come home smelling faintly of cologne, definitely not mine. Then there were the text messages. Too many for just work, if you ask me. I brushed it off though. She was an executive assistant and her boss, Daniel, was notorious for being demanding. Still, I couldn't shake this nagging feeling in my gut, a whisper telling me there was more to the story. For a while I buried it. Life was good, at least it seemed that way. Melissa and I had been married for 7 years. We'd built a home together. We didn't have kids, but we had dreams. Vacations, saving up for a cabin in the mountains, maybe even starting a family when the time felt right. On the surface, we were the perfect couple. But underneath, things had cooled. Our conversations were shorter, our time together more distracted. I chalked it up to stress, the routine grind of life. Relationships ebb and flow, right? That's what I told myself. Then came the night. Everything unraveled. It was a dinner party, hosted by her boss. Melissa had insisted I come, though she only mentioned it as an afterthought. Apparently, Daniel wanted to meet the spouses. I got dressed, watching her glide around the room with this practiced precision, putting on her makeup. She looked stunning, so stunning that it felt deliberate. When I told her so, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. It felt rehearsed, and that unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. At the party, Daniel greeted us with this big, toothy grin that oozed self-assurance. He was taller than I'd expected, with the kind of charisma that instantly makes you feel underdressed. He slapped me on the back, handed me a drink, and kept Melissa by his side all night, like she was the guest of honor. The way they interacted, it was impossible to miss. Laughs shared a little too easily. Touches on her lower back that lingered just a beat too long. I wanted to ignore it, but my gut was screaming at me by then. Then Daniel raised his glass for a toast. He smirked and said, "Congratulations, by the way, you two have so much to celebrate." Melissa froze beside me. Her eyes widened, her lips parting slightly, like she didn't know what to say. Confused, I looked from her to Daniel. "What are we celebrating?" I asked. Daniel's smirk deepened and he leaned in closer, raising his glass higher. "Congratulations on being a dad," he said. "I knocked up your wife." The words hit me like a freight train. My chest tightened and my vision tunneled. I turned to Melissa, praying she'd deny it. But instead, she took a deep breath and met my eyes with a mix of guilt and defiance. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, almost cold. "And you wouldn't even think about divorcing me. We live in a no-fault state. What's the point, right?" The room seemed to go silent. Or maybe it was just in my head. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart. I felt like I was drowning, gasping for air, in a space that suddenly felt way too small. I stared at her, searching for some shred of remorse, a flicker of the woman I thought I'd married, but she just looked back at me, daring me to react. The anger, the humiliation, the sheer weight of betrayal, it was too much. I didn't say a word. I just turned and walked away. Each step felt heavier than the last, my fists clenched so tight my nails dug into my palms. By the time I reached my car, something in me snapped. The anger boiled over, hardening into something darker, something deliberate. If they thought they could humiliate me, then watch me roll over and take it. They were dead wrong. They didn't know what I was capable of. Not yet. I grabbed something from the glove compartment and marched back inside. The laughter and chatter of the party fell silent when people saw me. Melissa turned, her face going pale as I walked straight toward her and Daniel. Her eyes locked on what I was holding and she screamed, "Don't do it, please!" But I wasn't listening. Not anymore. I had a plan. And no one was walking away from this unscathed. For the first few years, life was good. Really good. We didn't have kids, but we always talked about it. Melissa wanted to wait until her career was more stable, and I was okay with that. even though I was ready to be a dad. I'd dreamed about Little League games, school science projects, and teaching my kid how to fix things around the house. But Melissa's job always seemed to come first. Dreamt of the best for him and hoped to see more and more career prospects approach for me as the guidance. I didn't complain. I thought that's what a good husband did. You support your wife no matter what, right? I picked up extra shifts so she could chase her dreams. I didn't mind when she started working late or traveling more for business. I told myself it was all temporary. Once we had kids, everything would settle down. Except it didn't. Over time, things shifted. Melissa grew distant, colder. She stopped asking about my day. She didn't laugh at my jokes anymore. Our intimacy turned into something more like a routine than an act of love. And yet, I convinced myself it was just a phase. Every marriage has rough patches, I told myself. My dad used to say, love's not about the good times, it's about sticking around when things get hard. So that's what I did. I stuck it out. But now, looking back, I see the truth for what it was. While I was working overtime to give her everything, she was giving herself to someone else. The rage boiling inside me wasn't just about her betrayal. It was about the sheer injustice of it all. I thought about the sacrifices I'd made, the weekends spent fixing up the house, the promotions I'd turned down because they required travel, the late nights making sure everything was perfect for her. And for what? So she could throw it all away for some smirking jerk who thought he could strut into my life and take what was mine? And then there were his words, "You're going to be a dad." That sentence cut deeper than any knife ever could. I'd waited years for Melissa to tell me she was ready to have a baby. I'd dreamed of hearing those words. And now I find out she's pregnant with his child. I felt sick. My stomach churned, a twisted cocktail of rage and humiliation. Around me, the party guests stood frozen, their faces plastered with awkward disbelief. They weren't going to step in. Why would they? They didn't know me, didn't care about the destruction unfolding in front of them. Melissa's voice broke through my thoughts, trembling but still laced with defiance. "Let's talk about this later, okay? You're making a scene." A scene. My eyes locked on hers, my voice low and steady. "You want a scene, Melissa? Fine, you've got one, but I promise you, this is just the beginning." I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. A video started to play. A recording from a hidden camera I'd placed in our living room weeks ago. The audio was crystal clear. Daniel's smug voice oozed through the speakers. "You should just leave him. He's too boring for someone like you. You deserve more." The color drained from Melissa's face. The room went silent, except for the damning sound of the recording. "Don't worry," Daniel continued on the video. "He's too much of a pushover to do anything about it." I turned to Daniel, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Do I still seem like a pushover to you?" His smirk faltered, but before he could stammer out a response, I turned on my heel and headed for the door. As I reached it, I glanced back one last time and said, "You'd better lawyer up, both of you, because when I'm done, you'll wish you'd never met me." I sat in my car for hours that night, the glow of the streetlight pooling on the dashboard. I couldn't go back inside, not yet. My mind was a storm of questions I couldn't quiet. Why? How? What had led her to betray me so deeply? When I finally walked back into the house, Melissa was sitting on the couch, arms crossed, her face hard. She didn't look ashamed. If anything, she looked annoyed. "You want answers," she said, breaking the silence. "Fine, let's talk." I didn't sit. I stood in the doorway, my arms crossed, staring at her like she was a stranger. "Why, Melissa? That's all I want to know. Why?" She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You really want me to spell it out for you, how? You want me to be the bad guy so you can play the victim." "Bad guy?" I snapped. "You've slept with your boss and had the audacity to let him tell me about it in front of a room full of people. You're already the bad guy, Melissa. Own it." Her eyes narrowed, but for a split second, I saw something else. Guilt, maybe? Or just regret that she'd been caught. Fine, she said. You want the truth? Here it is. I was bored, okay? I was tired of this life, of the routine. It's always the same thing with you. Work, come home, watch TV, fix the faucet or the garage door or whatever. You're predictable, safe. I needed more. My jaw tightened. So you needed more. That's your excuse for tearing apart everything we built together? You don't get it, she hissed, her voice rising. Daniel made me feel alive. He made me feel wanted, like I was more than just some housewife waiting for you to finish tinkering in the garage. He listened to me. He appreciated me. I laughed. A hollow, bitter sound. Appreciated you? He used you, Melissa. And you let him. Her face twisted into something cruel. At least he saw me. You haven't seen me in years. You don't even know who I am anymore. And whose fault is that? I shot back, my voice rising to match hers. I've been here every single day, doing everything I can to make this life work. Maybe if you'd actually talked to me instead of sneaking around, we could have fixed this. But no, you took the coward's way out. Her lips quivered, but she didn't respond. I turned and walked out of the room, not trusting myself to stay. When I sat down with my lawyer and laid it all out, her eyes widened. This is a no-fault state, she said. But with evidence like this, we can definitely use it to your advantage, especially if her boss is involved. This could cost him more than just his job. Perfect. The next move? I reached out to Daniel's wife. Yes, he was married. His wife, Rachel, was the picture of sweet and unassuming, the kind of woman who hosted charity galas and baked cookies for the office at Christmas. She had no idea she was married to a snake. When I told her everything and showed her the proof, she broke down in tears. But then, something shifted in her. She wasn't just hurt, she was furious. Let's take them down, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Together, we crafted a plan. Rachel's lawyers filed for divorce, citing infidelity and workplace misconduct. She leaked the affair to Daniel's company, where he was promptly investigated and terminated. Turns out sleeping with a subordinate wasn't just unethical, it was illegal, especially since he'd been using company funds to bankroll their business trips. Melissa didn't escape unscathed either. Rachel and I made sure the story spread like wildfire through social circles, social media, everywhere. Melissa became a pariah. Her reputation was shredded beyond repair. Even her closest friends started to distance themselves. But the final blow? The divorce. I fought for everything. Legally, I couldn't take it all, but with the evidence I had, I leveraged every advantage. The house? Mine. The savings? Mine. Her cushy lifestyle? Gone. She moved into a dingy apartment, while her once proud boss, turned lover, was nowhere to be found. His career had imploded, leaving her with no one to lean on. This wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity. They thought they could break me, but I came out stronger. Sure, it hurt, still does sometimes, but when I look in the mirror, I see someone who fought back. Someone who refused to let their betrayal define him. As for Melissa, she'll have to live with what she did, knowing she threw away everything for a man who didn't even stick around. Months passed. On the surface, things felt like they were settling. Beneath it, though, the wreckage lingered. Melissa's betrayal wasn't something you just bounce back from. But for the first time in a long while, I was starting to see glimpses of a life without her. A better one. The house was mine now, one of the few victories that felt enormous. But it didn't look anything like it did when she lived there. I tore out the curtains she picked, replaced the sofa she called her sanctuary, and painted over the beige walls she adored with bold colors she would have hated. It felt new, fresh, mine. The neighborhood, though, was harder to escape. News of Melissa's affair had spread faster than wildfire. Every trip to the local coffee shop was met with whispered gossip and pitying glances. At first it was infuriating. I didn't want pity, I wanted justice. But the best revenge? A life well lived. So I focused on that. Melissa's downfall continued to unfold in ways I hadn't even orchestrated. Sometimes, karma has a way of finishing what you start. She tried to keep her job, but Daniel's scandal left a stain too big to ignore. The company didn't just fire him, they investigated everyone involved. The result? Melissa was let go under the guise of restructuring. Without her cushy salary, her world shrank fast. The socialite friends she'd laughed with over wine while secretly texting Daniel, they disappeared. The house parties she once hosted, gone. Memories she clung to as she packed her things into mismatched boxes. She called me one day, her voice was tentative, almost timid. Can we talk? I let out a humorless laugh. Talk now? You had years to talk, Melissa. What could you possibly have to say now? I'm sorry, she said quietly. I'm sorry for everything. I wanted to slam the phone down, but something in her tone stopped me. It wasn't the defiance or coldness I'd grown used to. It was desperation. She was drowning. For a fleeting moment, I almost pitied her. Almost. She tried to rebuild. Of course, they always do. But the whispers followed her everywhere. Job interviews turned her down. Friends who once adored her avoided her. Even her family, who'd once been so proud of her, kept her at arm's length. Melissa became a cautionary tale, a whispered warning in mutual circles. Don't end up like her. As for me, I moved on. Not perfectly, not without scars, but I moved forward. I wasn't the man I was before she betrayed me. I was stronger now, sharper. I didn't take my peace for granted anymore, and I didn't let anyone else define my worth. Maybe Melissa will find peace someday, but that's not my burden anymore. Months turned into a year, and life settled into a rhythm. Not perfect, but peaceful. The scars Melissa left hadn't vanished entirely, but they didn't ache like they used to. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was living life on my terms. No looking over my shoulder, no endless self-questioning about what I did wrong or how I could have been better. Just me, rebuilding piece by piece. Melissa was a ghost in my life now. The only reminders were the occasional stories I'd hear through the grapevine, how she'd burned through her savings, tried dating someone who quickly bailed, and was now living in a rundown apartment. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, but that part of me had grown smaller and smaller over time. The final confrontation happened by chance. It was a Friday night, and I'd taken Lauren out to dinner. Things had grown serious between us. She wasn't just someone to pass the time with. She was everything Melissa wasn't. Grounded, honest, supportive, the kind of person who makes you feel whole again. We were sitting outside a quiet restaurant, sharing dessert and laughing about something trivial when I saw her. Melissa. She was at a corner table, sitting alone. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes mismatched, like she'd thrown on whatever was clean. She looked smaller somehow, deflated. For a moment I thought she hadn't seen me, but then her eyes met mine. I nodded politely, more for my own closure than hers, and turned back to Lauren. But Melissa stood up, walking toward us. I could feel Lauren's hand tense slightly in mine. Melissa said, awkwardly, her voice hesitant. I wasn't sure if it was you. It's me, I replied simply. How are you, Melissa? She hesitated, as if debating whether to tell the truth or keep up appearances. I've been okay, she said finally, though her tone betrayed her words. We heard about the house. It looks great. You did a nice job. Thanks, I said, keeping my tone neutral. I didn't owe her warmth, but I wasn't going to stoop to her level either. Lauren, sensing the tension, squeezed my hand lightly. Melissa glanced at her, then back at me, her eyes softened, filling with something that looked like regret. I just wanted to say... She hesitated again, then continued, I'm sorry for everything, for what I did to you, to us. You didn't deserve it. The words hung in the air, heavier than I expected. Part of me wanted to fire back, to remind her how her selfishness had destroyed everything we built. But what would that accomplish? She already looked like she carried the weight of her choices every day. I know I didn't, I said evenly, but it's not about what I deserved anymore. It's about what I have now. I turned to Lauren and smiled. She smiled back, her warmth radiating in a way that made everything else fade. Melissa's face fell slightly, but she nodded, as if acknowledging the unspoken truth. "Take care, Melissa," I said, my tone final. She opened her mouth as if to say something else, but stopped. She just nodded again, turned, and walked away. And that was it. No grand drama, no fireworks, just the quiet resolution of a chapter I never wanted to revisit. In the end, the greatest revenge wasn't the scandal or the legal wins. It wasn't even seeing Melissa broken and alone. It was this. I was happy, truly, deeply happy. And she wasn't. The life I'd started building without her was full of possibility. Lauren and I had started talking about moving in together, maybe even starting a family someday. I'd thrown myself into work, taken a few risks that paid off, and found fulfillment there too. I was no longer the man Melissa had cast aside, no longer defined by her betrayal. The scars were still there, of course, but they were just that, scars. Not open wounds, not shackles, just a part of my story, a reminder of how far I'd come. As Lauren and I left the restaurant that night, I glanced back once. Melissa was gone, just like the hold she once had on me. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. And in that moment, I realized something. Melissa's biggest punishment wasn't what I did to her. It was knowing she'd gambled and lost, that she gave up love, trust, and a life we could have built together for nothing. She had to live with that. Me? I had everything I needed. Closure, peace, and a future worth looking forward to.